It's a privilege to work in universities, and it's an even greater privilege to work with the leading global thinkers that we have at our university. And Fiona is certainly one of those. And through this lecture series, we are sharing our very, very best research to engage and inspire you. And I'm sure we will be inspired by Fiona this evening, but we have the privilege of being inspired by her every day. So our most recent professors are offering enlightening explanations about their own research and subject areas, and conducting internationally significant research means that our academics always have their fingers on the pulse and are at the forefront of their latest research findings and emerging trends. So this evening, as I say, we celebrate the promotion of Fiona Macaulay to Professor of Gender, Peace and Development. Fiona joined the university in 2005, and since that time is a colleague that has been held in very, very high regard across our university and beyond, and we are most proud of her achievements. I am delighted that Fiona will be presenting her inaugural address to you this evening. And Fiona, I want to give you my personal thanks, congratulations, and please, please keep the Bradford spirit going, and I know you will. So Fiona is also the director of the Rotary Peace Centre here at the University of Bradford. And we have our supporters here from there, Keith at the back, who's, I think, been here all day. Doing his usual work to support us from the Rotary Peace Centre. And Fiona is currently supporting our 21st intake of Rotary Peace Fellows. I mean, that's amazing, 21st intake from around the world. And since joining in 2005, much of Fiona's work has focused on challenging attitudes to violence against women in Latin America. She's worked with numerous organisations, including the police, to help them understand how to deal with domestic and other forms of gender-based violence. Now, she's going to tell us a lot about this, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Fiona. Fiona and her brother, who was with us this evening, were born in Northern Ireland to Scottish parents. They moved to the Fens, and she started at a convent school in Wisbech, where she learned Latin, which was to prove very useful for acquiring languages later on in her career. After attending schools in Peterborough and Huntingdon, Fiona won an open scholarship to Hertford College, Oxford, to read modern languages. Whilst there, she became politically active, in fact, a political activist, campaigning on violence against women, joining student-run seminars on feminist theory, spending cold nights outside Greenham Common, protesting at nuclear weapons that were stationed there. You wouldn't believe it looking at her now, would you? No, you would not. You wouldn't believe it. But when she gets that gown off and she's back in the classroom and out there, she is still a political activist. After university, Fiona won a Rotary Foundation graduate scholarship, and isn't it amazing that here she is now leading the Rotary scholarships? And she read women's studies at the University of Massachusetts. She became involved in campaigning against the US-sponsored wars in Central America. She travelled to Nicaragua and spent a year teaching English at the National Autonomous University in Nicaragua, Leon. And she managed the diverse development projects by Oxford Leon, twinning and travelling through Central America, interviewing human rights activists. That must have been your heaven, interviewing human rights activists. Those experiences formed the bedrock of her research interests. So after returning from Central America, Fiona continued to campaign on human rights and worked for a student-based social justice organisation, Third World First, which now many of you will know is People and Planet. She then returned again to the University of Oxford and was awarded an MPhil in Latin American Studies and then a DPhil in Politics. I mean, what an amazing career, Fiona. Her dissertation focused on the relationship between women's representation, political parties, women's movements, and public policy in Brazil and Chile. For that, she interviewed scores of women politicians, in both countries to understand their motivations, their pathways into politics and achievements. And the day after she handed in her dissertation, Fiona joined the International Secretariat of Amnesty International as their Brazilian researcher. Amazing. That job took her far afield, visiting 60 prisons and documenting the conditions of some of the most overcrowded and inhumane detention centres in Latin America. You can imagine this was a challenging job. She had to do many, many difficult things, but they included negotiating her way out of being taken hostage in a prison. She was thrown out of a police station for uncovering evidence of torture, and she was followed by hired gunmen as she investigated persecution of land right activists. I mean, what determination and bravery, you know, to make sure that these things were known and published and understood. Her time at Amnesty International confirmed Fiona's conviction that reform in criminal justice systems was both an imperative and was possible, by always seeking to identify opportunities for local change makers and by sharing good practice. After Fiona's son Joe was born, who's here today as well, Fiona returned to academia and held a joint appointment as a researcher and coordination of the Human Rights Programme at the University of London's Institute of Latin American Studies and at the University of Oxford Centre for Brazilian Studies. So on joining our Peace Studies department in 2005, Fiona introduced immersive learning and helped develop extended simulations, such as the International Crisis and Diplomacy game. And I can tell you that when I speak to our students, this is one of the highlights of their experiences in Bradford. So you've been innovative in your learning and teaching, Fiona, for many, many years, and I know it will continue. Her research into criminal justice from reform led most recently to designing a training programme on domestic violence for the police in Brazil. This was developed in partnership with the Brazilian Forum on Public Safety and funded by Uber and Avon. And Fiona tells us that, you know, as a result of the Avon connection, she has a great collection of lipsticks. And I thought I'll just bring my one along with me this evening, which is just a number 7. That's all I've got. But this training manual is now being used by police forces across Brazil. So does Fiona have any spare time? Well, apart from teaching and research, Fiona's main outlet for her passion for social change has been Peace Jam. And in 2006, she brought this international organisation to the University of Bradford. And since then, several Nobel Peace Prize winners, hundreds of student mentors and teenagers have come together here on our campus at Bradford to develop the skills that young people need to become change makers and peacemakers in their communities. And it is needed now more than ever. She enjoys gardening and playing music and would love to be a jazz trumpeter if reincarnated in another life. I'm sure we can find that way possible in this life, Fiona. So joining us this evening, we're pleased to welcome Fiona's partner, Adrian, her son, Joe, her brother, Alistair, her cousin, Sarah, her stepsisters, Joe and Ginny, and watching online is her sister, Jackie, and a friend of many, many, many years, Diana? Yeah, who is an academic at the University of Liverpool. Am I right there? Yeah. So you are all very, very welcome. And Fiona, we all applaud you for what you've achieved to date. Congratulations on becoming a professor. And I now invite you to deliver your inaugural lecture, Gender-Based Violence and Human Rights Abuse in Brazil. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for those kind words. And it's a privilege to be here at the university and to give this talk. And, you know, Bradford is very special, and the Peace Studies and International Development Department is very special because we get the most incredible students from around the world. And I think some of my former students are listening online. So greetings to them, to our alumni. And I think many of my colleagues in Brazil, my friends and colleagues, will also be online. But it is a very, very special place. And for that, I'm also very privileged to be the director of the Rotary Peace Centre, because as you could tell, sort of in my career, having that Rotary Fellowship was fundamental. absolutely fundamental. It took me to Central America, it took me to do women's studies, and the rest is history. That's what I do. I do gender and I study Latin America. So really, those scholarships are transformational. So it gives me great joy that many of the Rotary students are here this evening, some of them listening online, and I hope it will be just as transformational for you as well. So I think I may stand here in front of the lectern. Hopefully you can all see me. I've got my biggest platform shoes on account of the length of the gown. But without further ado, I want to talk about Brazil mainly this evening, and I make no apologies for talking about Brazil because it is the 5th largest country, a huge population of nearly 250 million people, one of the 10th largest economies in the world, and it has 60% of the Brazilian Amazon contained within its boundaries. And I want to start by talking about Sunday. On Sunday, there were elections in Brazil. These were the two main contenders, Lula Inácio da Silva, who had previously been president, versus Jair Bolsonaro, who is the incumbent president. And it's gone to a second round election. Preliminary results are in for the legislature. And why does all of this matter to people who are not Brazilian? Well, let me just show you. This is a map of Brazil. The red shows you at a granular level, to municipal level, not at a state level, the difference in voting patterns. The red is votes for Lula. The blue is votes for Jair Bolsonaro. Now, there is a thing called the arc of deforestation, and the blue patch you can see in the middle exactly follows that arc of deforestation. And you can map that very clearly. This map here also shows you the overlap between voting patterns and deforestation in the state of Amazonas. And just a few weeks ago, a couple of months ago, there was the murder in the Amazon of a Guardian journalist, Dom Phillips, and his colleague, Bruno Pereira. And there have been scores of assassinations of land activists and indigenous leaders in the Amazon region. So if you wanted any reason to care about Brazil this evening, it would be that it really matters. The runoff election will be in 3 weeks' time. And of course, people will vote for who they want to, but this is possibly world changing who is elected in these coming elections. Now, the anniversary, so Sunday was another anniversary, it's another significant date. The 2nd of October also marks 30 years on from Latin America's most notorious prison massacre, where 111 prisoners were murdered in cold blood by police who had gone in to control a riot. My predecessor at Amnesty International investigated it, and it was quite evident that the prisoners had been executed. They were stripped naked, they were shot in the back of the head. Now, and this shows a picture of 2 prisoners back in the prison after the massacre. Nobody has ever gone to jail for that crime. There have been trials, there's been prosecutions, there have been appeals, and the leader of the police at that time then decided to run as a politician using the number 111 as his number. That's the system they use in Brazil, that you vote putting in a number. So impunity, the lack of functioning of judicial institutions, the fact that 30 years on, nobody has been held responsible for that crime is also a very significant issue. So for me, all of this fits together. My work on political parties, democracy and how it's secured on a daily basis. The role of civil society is mostly what I'll be talking about this evening, because organizations like Amnesty International and the many organizations within Brazil are fundamental for holding to account the coercive forces of the state, the police, but also the judiciary and other state authorities. So hence my decision to talk about institutions and how they can be scrutinized and how they can be changed, because it seems to me that that is fundamental to the functioning of democracy. There is a social contract in liberal theory, that there is an agreement between the governed and the governing that rights will be expected and respected. But that breaks down, and it breaks down when there is insufficient scrutiny. And all of that is tied to the rule of law and human rights. So if I'm joining the dots going backwards on my life, then Amnesty International is a huge part of that. You already mentioned many of those elements, but the day, my first week at university, I went to Freshers' Fair and I joined Amnesty International, and I have been a member ever since, continuously. And in a way, that was also one of the most fundamental things I ever did, was make that decision and commitment. Now, I then went to work for Amnesty International, as you said, and one of the first things I did was investigate the prison system. At that time, Amnesty International didn't routinely look at the functioning of whole institutions. They tended to look at abuses against particular political prisoners, for example. But clearly, there was a crisis within that system. So, for example, you can see these are in thousands by the tens. So it's the last figure is 841,000 people are incarcerated in Brazil. It's in the top 3 worldwide of prison populations. Now, one of the frustrations, both in Amnesty International and subsequently as an academic, is watching that curve climb continually and trying to figure out why it seems rational to some political actors to continually fill a system that can't cope, because in that entire time the system has been 100%, 150% overloaded. It never catches up to capacity, and it is a locus of huge human rights abuses, overcrowding, the gangs running prisons, torture and abuses is endemic to a system which is essentially out of control. So my very first visit to a prison in Brazil was to this place, Carandiru, which I've already mentioned. It was the largest prison in Latin America at the time. It held 9,000 inmates. And I went with an incredible American priest who worked with the Catholic Church's ministry to prisoners, who at the time were essentially the principal civil society organizations going in on a daily basis and checking up on abuses. And this is where he took me, which is known as the dungeon. And it's where the prisoners who were threatened with death by other prisoners were incarcerated. They couldn't leave because otherwise they'd be killed by other prisoners. It was a kind of a vision of Dante's hell. And also, I realized that visiting prisons, one shouldn't wear open-toed sandals, because what was on the floor there was rainwater and a mixture of pretty indescribable other substances from the sewers and so forth. But again, it comes back to kind of human rights concerns. It doesn't really matter what the men in those overcrowded, stinking cells had done. It didn't matter whether they killed people, and indeed they had. What mattered was whether a democratic state should be treating them that way. And the prison cells were extremely overcrowded. This is a police station. And it was no wonder that when I went to visit one of these police stations with this intolerable level of overcrowding, that was the incident that was referred to. They saw a foreigner walking into the courtyard, and they thought, hey, taking her hostage will create a bit of publicity for our cause. And in fact, the police chief actually mentioned that to them, which was unhelpful. So I then had to deal with him. But again, completely intolerable. So this situation, of course, will also continue depending on the outcome of the elections. But I would safely say that many political leaders have failed to really appreciate, if you like, this is like the back end of the legal system. For those who look at the criminal justice system, nobody likes to look at prisons, right? They're unpleasant, nobody likes to visit them, but they tell you a lot more about the logic of criminal justice systems when you go to the back end, the forgotten end. So why are some institutions reluctant to change? Well, indeed, extremely resistant in many cases. That's the question I've always wanted to think about. Technocratic culture, oh, we know best, particularly the judiciary or the police. Oh, you don't understand our job. And particularly criminal justice systems are very self-sufficient. They don't like scrutiny. They believe they do something so specialized that nobody can engage with them. So a lot of what I've tried to understand is those internal logics, but also to work with organizations that do genuinely engage with those institutions to try and figure out what they have in common and the common agendas. So I mentioned the Brazilian Forum on Public Security, which is an extraordinary NGO that I work with, that brings together policymakers, police officers, researchers to try and get through those boundaries so that change can actually be designed collectively. And in many cases, you know, institutions are extremely resistant to change. So one of the questions I always had was what might work? Where can you see change and promote it, even though in other parts of the institution they may be very, very resistant and shrug off all attempts to make them work differently. And a lot of that comes down to external governance. It comes down to a lack of accountability. And one of the things that I have written about a long time ago was looking at police oversight in Brazil. And essentially, it works like this. One institution is meant to oversee the police. It doesn't work. Let's put another institution in charge of doing that. Oh, that doesn't work either. Let's try another bit of the system to try and do that. I think I identified 9 different oversight bodies for the police and similarly for the prison system. It's that kind of resistance which means that the kind of, you know, massive overcrowding of the prison system continues. But that's where civil society comes in as well, because they're absolutely fundamental. So when you see civil society being denied the right to go in and inspect and to scrutinize, then you really do have a problem, because the changes that have occurred have largely occurred because of civil society activism, and best still when they work together with state actors. That's me. Again, I want to go back to my days at Amnesty and to acknowledge the fact that an organisation that has credibility like Amnesty International actually does get listened to. That was what I understood, that when I went to see officials, I was not going as me, Fiona, I was going as a representative of a global organisation. And I literally had people not quite jumping out of the windows, but actually refusing to meet with me or pretending that they were coming up in the lift and they never appeared an hour later. So that power was interesting, and we shouldn't forget it. I mean, so a lot of what I'm going to say this evening is about making sure that protest and accountability for non-governmental organizations is robust in democracies, not just in Brazil, but here and elsewhere. Accountability is a word that you can't translate in Spanish or Portuguese. It has no single translation, but it consists of 3 parts: taking responsibility, acknowledging when something has gone wrong and taking responsibility; monitoring, which is obviously what civil society does very well. And I've worked with a lot of organizations that go into prisons and that monitor and report back and exert pressure. And honestly, the other official systems don't really work. I continually asked, well, where do the reports go? Nobody knew where the reports went. They didn't go anywhere. But the reports that came out through the church or through human rights groups did go somewhere. They went to political forum, they went to assemblies, they went to the United Nations. And that is also extremely important. And transparency, the ability to actually go in and see for yourself what is happening, is extremely important. So those are kind of principles of working together with resistant organizations, that those seem to be the kind of the keys. And of course, one of the other story that I'll tell some examples this evening is about how you work with international actors, that what's called in the political theory the boomerang effect. You know, the government of the day won't talk to you, but you can go to the United Nations, you can go to the Inter-American system, and you can exert pressure back on the society. And that has worked extremely well for the stories that I'm going to tell. So one of the success stories was actually that Carandiru was blown up. It was destroyed. And for that, you needed both international pressure and a reformer in place who decided to do that. It didn't solve the rest of the problems. The prison system in Sao Paulo is still miserable and it's not transparent, but at least this happened. So one of the things you learn, at least trying to figure out how institutions can be moved to change, is it's a long game, and there are cycles, there are successes and defeats. But you don't have any option other than to keep going. So this is it being blown up, and it doesn't exist anymore. I was very aware of how do you get from a very abusive situation to a better situation? What happens? Now, this prison here, the Casa de Passagem, was in a state called Espírito Santo. And again, I went there on behalf of Amnesty International, and you can see that there's a gap on the parapet with the prisoners standing there. The day before I went, there had been a riot in the prison, which was entirely controlled by the prisoners. All the doors had been pulled off the prison. There were no guards. And they had been rioting to get their demands met and been throwing their colleagues off the roof at hourly intervals. So I went with a group of human rights activists locally, and we carried out the most bizarre collective interviews on the flat roof, on this roof, where I can't believe quite how naive I was. I said, put your hands up if you've been tortured in police custody. So yeah, a sea of hands went up. And it was evident that the state had completely abandoned this prison. Completely. It held full responsibility for what had happened there because it had abdicated responsibility. The situation got even worse. They ended up with prisoners in containers in broiling tropical temperatures. You can imagine how unpleasant that was. So I never went back until I heard about a reform process that had been undertaken, and that I wanted to know about. I wanted to find out how this had happened, what ideas had influenced it, how they'd managed to get the political system to back a proper reform process. So this is me outside a maximum security prison in which the state was fully in control. There were no murders of prisoners by other prisoners. The state had exerted its control within the prison, at least to that extent that it was decent and humane and under control. You can give a complete critique of, a prison system as swollen as the Brazilian one, but the minimum is that you don't allow people to be murdered while they're in your facility. And you can see something of the kind of the militarized ethos in the branding of the prison behind with the cross rifles. So it's a conception, obviously, that I'm not very comfortable with, but I have to at least acknowledge where good practices work towards the purposes of human rights protection. And so I think that people interested in human rights are always kind of glass half full or half empty, because there's always abuses. But there are also things that people are genuinely trying to do better. And when I did the work the first time around in Brazil, I worked with Professor Roy King from Bangor University, and from him I really understood the importance of looking at the good practices, looking at the chinks of light that you could work with. So when we produced our report, we highlighted good practices, which seemed bizarre given how chaotic the situation was, but where we could find something that seemed to be right, we emphasized it with the view of saying, if you can get this right here, why not everywhere? And it was interesting because Human Rights Watch produced their report at the same time, and it was a brilliant report, but very negative. So none of the state authorities wanted to talk to the Human Rights Watch folk, and they wanted to talk to me because I'd said something at least halfway positive. So it was a lesson to me about thinking about positive change, even at the smallest, most granular level of institutions. So civil rights organizations do super important things. They demand new practices. They monitor them. So, for example, I did a piece of work looking at how a coalition of NGOs had come together, what's called the Criminal Justice Network, and they had worked collectively to figure out a new process that could be instituted to keep people out of the prison system. Again, this was a process tracing thing. I went and talked to them. How did this happen? What were your influences? Who did you go and influence? What was your leverage? How did this get through? And the custody hearings are intended to be a screening of new prisoners to keep them out of the system. So they're partially successful. I won't overclaim for it, but it seemed very important to acknowledge the fact that this initiative had come from civil society. Good practices exist, and therefore they need to be picked up and amplified. And I'm going to talk in a second about one of those good practices, which is the Resocialization Centers, because again, you have to look at what is positive. And this was an interesting example of a collaboration between civil society and the state in prison management. And again, hadn't really been written about. So a lot of my career seems to be going, oh, that looks really interesting. Nobody seems to have written about this. I want to know more. I want to know how this works, why this works, and who got it going, and whether it could be replicated. So these small community prisons were pioneered initially by a Catholic civil society group, and then I studied the non-religious variant of it. And you can see, compared to the previous picture that I showed you of sort of disgusting and overcrowded conditions, these are clean, these are dignified. You actually have bathrooms that function, they're not broken, they've not got rats coming out of the toilets, they've got bars for disabled prisoners. Interestingly, I like this picture because somebody said that looks very sort of feminine, well, maybe flowers. But what was interesting was that many of these prisons, men's prisons, were run by women who had a psychology or educational background. So they were the absolute opposite, the inverse of everything I had seen in the main system. They upended every logic of the mainstream prison system. And you can see that, you know, they grew their own foods, they had their own bakeries and kitchens and so forth. They had work, they had education, they had community connections. And to a certain extent, these kinds of prisons are being replicated across Brazil in the more religious variant, but it's taken a while. So I wrote about this and published, and gradually these are being picked up, but they don't really dent the enormity of the prison system. But I think that's it. I think there's the chinks of light approach that I have. I really want to find things that upturn the logic of an abusive system. And this last picture, I was at an event. I was on a panel, and I went to sit down and with my fellow panelists, and the guy on the left, Greg, he said, I know you. I said, oh, have we met? He said, yeah. He said, I was in prison. He was in one of these community prisons. And he said, I remember you came to visit and I held the door open for you. And you said, I think this is terribly British. I said, no, you first, please, honest. And he remembered that exchange. But in prison, he studied law. He's a lawyer now. He's a criminal lawyer. And he defends people and keeps them out of prison. So, you know, like I say, it's the glass half full. There are things that can change. So the other part of what I have done with my career is also think about gender politics. And you kindly mentioned that was my doctoral research, looking at women in politics in these two countries, which had just come out of dictatorships. And I was really intrigued at how women's representation in political parties could change public policy. And political parties are also pretty resistant to having new ideas and new people enter them. So I interviewed a lot of these women all around the country. But that concern with how do women's groups change public policy has been a central one. And many of the same questions are the same as the previous point about the prison system. So again, this is highly relevant to what's going on in the UK at the moment. That placard, if you can read it, says 2 women a week are killed. That figure in the UK has not changed in years. So the police in the UK have a real crisis in relation to their practices around gender-based violence. We've practically decriminalised rape in this country because the prosecution rates are way below 5%. which is a scandal, isn't it? So understanding how police cultures maintain that attitude is pretty important. So around the world, there has actually been a surge of protests about feminicide, about the murders of women, largely by intimate partners or former partners, sometimes by strangers, but mostly it's connected with domestic violence. So you could find images of women protesting in France, Peru, Argentina, Russia, Mexico in particular. Well, Mexico, which has the highest rate of feminicide, and a government which completely denies that there is a problem. It actually accuses women protesting of somehow trying to overthrow the government. So the culture, the underlying cultural norms that sustain the view that women are disposable, that women can be subject to violence, because of certain narratives about, you know, you belong to me, you're mine, you should be, you turned me down. There's all of those kind of narratives around control. They're cross-cultural. They're as current in Brazil as they are in the UK or in France. So in wanting to write about the gender and policing, I ended up focusing on feminicide, which is defined as the deliberate killing of a woman or girl because they are women. Now that, in a way, that's what the Brazilian law says. That phrase seems to not make any sense at all. Because they're women, what the heck does that mean? But that's because it refers to, because they are women and there are social expectations about how women should behave and how they should be controlled socially. So the killing of women is because they are regarded as disposable, inferior, controllable, and so forth. So it's very often linked with domestic intimate partner violence and a kind of a contempt. I'm not sure that contempt is the word used in the Brazilian law, which I find really interesting. I don't know that it's misogyny. I'm not sure that it's hatred of women. I think it's actually control. I think it's about control. And the image I put up there is from the project that I did with Kala Sangam and Mitul and Shambik from Rhythm Mosaic. If any of you were at that performance that we did in Theatre in the Mill. And I have at least one of the students who's on stage is with me this evening. So the numbers in Brazil are not, I mean, I don't know how one even compares country to country. I'm not even going to do that. Those are the figures for last year. That is a complete underestimation. It is more likely to be about 55% of total murders are feminicized. They're motivated by these factors. And we're going to talk in a second about how we measure that and how the system has begun to understand that it is very important to name particular forms of violence. Now, everything I'm going to say in the next section, I can happily confirm that none of these things would have happened had it not been for women's movements mobilization. One of the great pioneers of protecting women who are victims of domestic violence, she said to me, well, look, you know, we would never have done this if women hadn't demanded it. The police would never have innovated. They would not have moved. So the next part of the story is about how, perhaps surprisingly, institutions in Brazil have been pushed to do better on this front, and conceivably better than in the UK, in the sense that they've been a lot more responsive. So this is the book that came out last year, and it asked that kind of question. And I realized that although that there was a literature on feminicide in Mexico and Latin America, because that term was very much coined in Latin America, there was very little that explained what could realistically be done to lower those indices. And again, if we've become complacent in the UK with having 2 women a week murdered by their partner or former partner, and that doesn't shock us, then we need to start asking about what can change. So I wanted to know, how were police and judicial institutions responding to that demand from women for change? And for that, I used a process tracing approach, which I always find most interesting, which is to actually talk to the actors concerned and ask them, why did you do this thing that you did? What were your influences? Because you can guess, but you might be completely wrong. And there's many, many fascinating stories from the change makers at the base that tell you why they did what they did. So this again is an image from the performance that we did. And in that performance, we told the story of feminicide through three women, through Maria da Peña, who had, her husband had attempted to murder her twice, had left her paraplegic, and her fight for justice eventually took her to contact women's groups who took the case to the Inter-American human rights system. And I remember that case because she had fought for justice for 18 years. And I was in Brazil for Amnesty International. I came back to my London office and I said, I don't know, should we campaign on this? And unfortunately, the answer was, well, I don't know, it doesn't seem very current case. It turned out to be an absolutely game-changing case for the debate on domestic violence in Brazil. This woman, Angela Diniz, who had her murder, she was a socialite, and her murder had led to a celebrity trial in which the celebrity lawyer, the defense lawyer, had made all the wrong arguments about how, you know, she was a femme fatale. She had, you know, what could she expect? You know, you know, her ex-boyfriend had just lost his head. He'd gone crazy. It wasn't his fault. And this is tied to a very common defense strategy in Brazil. So women's movements groups were furious about the way in which men were constantly acquitted of domestic or intimate partner violence and murders. And this woman, Dandara dos Santos, who was a transsexual, who was brutally beaten to death by a mob in her hometown for no other reason than that they chose to despise her for how she presented herself to the world. And again, that in terms of thinking about the protection of vulnerable individuals and intersectionality, this was also a game-changing case. So the story of how feminicide began to be tackled better starts really with Maria da Peña up here, because the law is what changed. So sorry, I hope you can read this okay. So they take the case to the Inter-American Commission. Women's groups and human rights groups go to an external source of legitimacy, the Boomerang effect. The condemnation from the Commission about Brazil's absolute failure to deal with domestic violence issues then led to a very comprehensive law, the Maria da Peña law, named after her. The law is really important because without the law, nothing else changes. The law was designed to make all of the other institutions work properly. They demanded that the police did their job, the different elements of the police force. It demanded that the prosecution service and the judiciary did their bit properly, and that all the bits of the system should work together. The women's groups assisting the victims with the judges, with the prosecutors, with the police. And I really, truly believe that that process, which took 2 years, by the way, it took 2-year consultation amongst women's groups around the country to produce that law. And that third point, that police respond institutionally, they have to do it because it says in the law, you must protect domestic violence victims. So police begin to think to themselves, how do we do this? Because it says we have to do this. It's nothing quite like telling an institution they got to do something to make them actually begin thinking about it. And so by 2005, the need for the feminicide law became very, very clear because although domestic violence was being dealt with somewhat, women were still being murdered. So clearly there was a gap. And the gap was essentially that women would report domestic violence, they would get a restraining order from the judge, from the court, and like they would say, was useless, it's a piece of paper. What's going to happen when he comes to my house in the middle of the night? There's nobody there. So police began thinking about how to fill that gap. And the image at the top is of the current president, Jair Bolsonaro, who in an altercation with Maria do Rosário, who was a fellow legislator, said, and I quote, oh, I wouldn't bother raping you because you're too ugly. And that violence really pushed the women in Congress to get the feminicide law through as quickly as possible, because they were so outraged that a legislator could utter something like that. So the criminal justice system has very much been influenced by the women's movement at every point. So this is my point about civil society. It doesn't just monitor, it changes. They've gone and they've used international and regional actors. They've pushed through the Maria da Peña law. They pushed through the feminicide law. They changed the jurisprudence. So you're no longer allowed to argue as a defense lawyer, you know, in a case of where a woman has been murdered, oh, well, you know, he felt offended. He felt his honor had been, you know, offended by her actions. He was, that's why he killed her. No, can't do that anymore. So every bit of the system had to respond, the police, the prosecutors, the judges, and women who were active within bits of the state bureaucracy were also extremely important, because they could actually change all of these kinds of attitudes. Yeah. I'm just looking at the time now. I think I'm going to give 10 more minutes. Am I good for that? So the criminal justice system response to this has been interesting, and it has really picked up. So in the past, these police stations were all over Brazil. They continue to be all over Brazil, but they're in the main towns. They're in the main towns. So what happens when you're threatened? You can't drive to the state capital. So one of the things I picked up in my book was the way in which individual female police officers had really pushed for change and had taken it upon themselves to make things better and to intervene. And I do love this photo. Look, they look like kind of Charlie's Angels. But the woman in the middle, Eugenia, who is a police chief, has done fantastic work on really understanding why feminicide occurs and how the police can and should respond to it better. So figuring out when a woman is murdered for reasons based on gender, very important. Otherwise, you never, ever change the data set that you're working with. And the feminicide watches were set up by women's groups and by newspapers to log the murders. Improving police data was important, setting up specialist investigation units. All of that has changed the quality of police activity, but it's come from the middle of the system. It's come from police officers working in the middle, being influenced by women's groups and working collaboratively and together. It's a very interesting story. So the bits of the system began to get their act together, to understand that this was something that they had to act on. So some, you know, the figures, although there is still a high level of feminicide in Brazil, it is still extremely important to understand that they have done so much better because of all of those factors coming together. One of the interesting questions was, how do we assess when we get a report of domestic violence? How do we know whether that woman will be murdered next week? That's a big question in this whole field, right? So risk assessment tools are extremely difficult to design, but they're clearly pretty crucial, because how do you know where to put the resources for protection? So the last thing that I want to talk about in the last few slides is prevention, because this is also something which remarkably the Brazilians have innovated on. So the police had this requirement that they protect women. It says it in the law. So they realized that they were not responding in a way that was going to protect women from their partner coming back to the house and murdering them. So in a number of different states simultaneously, they began setting up these specialist patrols. They're called Maria da Peña patrols. And when the woman, now they've got the system really streamlined. So when the woman gets issued the protection order, the restraining order by the court, that goes straight to the police, and these specialized units then go straight to the house. They talk to the victim, they talk to the perpetrator, they explain the law, and they tell them what's going to happen next. And then they go back and visit on a weekly, daily, monthly basis as required. Guess what? Women who are enrolled in these programs I think most of them report 0 feminicides, because it's a really, really interesting intervention. They use technology. So this is the police control center where they got all the data kind of coming in. I hope you can see that picture there. There's lots of pictures of motorbikes, and it's the motorbike riding municipal police. But that basically means that when they get the information through that they've had a report, they're straight there. So the system has got a lot more streamlined. There are about 400 of these police patrols around Brazil now. There's nothing published on them or written on them. It's very interesting, and they have spread in a very sort of horizontal fashion, which is to say that police officers have become interested in what their colleagues in other states have been doing. They've trained themselves, they've copied, they've invited colleagues to come and train them, and none of this had come from the top of the system. It's all come from the middle of the system, which I find absolutely fascinating. Which is why I'm going to end on a point that says, institutions are not monolithic. You may have a view about the police, you may have a view about police violence, and there's plenty of police violence in Brazil, but none of those institutions are monolithic. In every institution, there are people who are trying to be change makers and who are trying to uphold the kind of the core values that those institutions are meant to be upholding. So law pushes changes, local women's protection networks push change as well. Evidence-led policing, so a lot of this was informed by people looking at the data. Guess who gets re-victimized the most? If you look at the data, women who are victims of domestic violence report most re-victimization. Pracademics was an interesting finding. In my book, I quote at least half of the work quoted there is written on master's courses by police officers who've gone back to college to study and professionalize themselves, and they get the academic tools available to them to analyze the data to which they have access on a day-to-day basis and to draw conclusions from it. Now, the reason I put that research paper up there is that I interviewed a colonel in Minas Gerais who had pioneered one of these patrols in his neighborhood, and he said, oh yeah, he said, when I was doing my master's course, I read this really interesting study from West Yorkshire Police. Really? So I went and found it from 1999. It was a pilot project, and Jalna Hamner used to teach here. In fact, there are 2 academics from Bradford University who wrote this report. It's an excellent report, analysing a very, very similar intervention pilot project that had occurred here in West Yorkshire. It's a fantastic piece of work, and that's one of the things that happens in institutions, that sometimes things get lost. But it didn't get lost because it got read by a police colonel in the middle of Brazil. It got read by police in San Diego who'd read the same report and done pretty much the same thing. So I do find another aspect of the work I do is about policy transfer, how ideas travel, and they don't travel in the directions you think. They can travel north to south, south to north, and I think it's really important to understand what we can learn from policy initiatives in the global south. There's a whole new area of southern criminology coming up which says, no, we need to stop thinking that all the good ideas are going to come from the global north, because many of those institutions are struggling with exactly the same problems. So good practices has always been something, as I mentioned earlier, that was very important to look at. And this has been something that the Brazilian Forum on Public Security has really pioneered. And all of these booklets look at good practice in protecting women from domestic violence. And the picture at the top is me in New Scotland Yard with some of the winners of those competitions. And that was a very interesting trip. It also made me realise how much they had to contribute to in conversations with the British police, not vice versa. So I'm just going to end on the police training because that's the last point. So I realised that there was a real desire amongst the Brazilian police who worked on gender-based violence to be trained, but to be trained in a way that was effective. And when I say the word genesis there, where did all this come about? Again, it's like one of those long pathways. When I worked at Amnesty International years ago, I talked to people who did police training in Brazil, and they mentioned how impactful it was to engage police on a personal level with personal experiences. We also did a report about our own police training that said, if you just stand and lecture people, it doesn't work. You know, it actually makes things worse. So then when I was here at Bradford, the students said, we don't think you teach gender very well. I was like, okay, no, we don't. So let's think about how we do it better. And I realized you had to integrate personal reflection with ideas, with practical applications, gender labs, and that began to work really well. So when I had a chance conversation about, you know, with a colleague who runs the Brazilian Forum on Public Safety, I realized, oh, I could run something with the Brazilian police. Let's see if it works. Found a Brazilian colleague, let's test it. Turns out it worked. So ideas that had come from way back that got tested and refined here at the university, I was then able to take into a completely different environment. Using basic principles that the people in front of you know lots. Freirean pedagogy, they're not ignorant, they're full of knowledge. You just need to find a way to bring that knowledge out. To appreciate what they already do. There's nothing more dispiriting than being told you're doing everything wrong, right? And that creates resistance, whereas appreciating what people actually do and you build on is much more effective. It's interactive in a way that we used here. It integrates those three elements of emotion, logic, knowledge, and hands-on application. And this manual is designed to be a multiplier, which is to say it's meant to train trainers. So anybody can use the exercises in it to train other people. So just the last couple of slides with some pictures here. This is me testing. You can see me vaguely in the corner there. I thought we're doing a sort of role play. Police very much enjoy role play, particularly if they're arresting perps. Lots of group work. I also insisted that the police came without their uniforms, without their guns. Mapping, again, what do you already know about your city that you can externalize, that you can express, building on local knowledge. So gratifyingly, this training project has been adopted by police forces around Brazil. So most notably in a state in the south of Brazil, in Rio Grande do Sul, it's now been adopted. I think over 1,000 new police officers have now been trained using this methodology. So you can see they're effectively doing the same kinds of things, brainstorming, group work. This is an exercise. You won't know what it is, but I know what it is. Exploring power and intersectionality, relative power. There you go. There's the role play. There's the perpetrator lying on the ground. And this is exploring myths around gender-based violence. So very nice gratifying to know that the things that we put in, we tested and piloted, that we hoped would work, are working, so that the knowledge, the understanding is greater. So in summary, because I asked a question at the beginning, what produces change? Well, leadership and vision, sometimes it can come from the top. It can come from people being determined to do things differently, like with blowing up Carandiru and setting up these alternative prisons. A lot of the policy entrepreneurs are in the middle of the system. Yeah, they see that things need to change and they get on and find the resources to do so. So institutions are not monolithic. There are spaces and places for people to change. Civil society, very, very important partner. Sometimes we think of kind of human rights and particularly criminal justice institutions as being sort of opposed to one another. And that's often the rhetoric, but in the way it's the glass half full and the glass half empty. I'm going to criticize you, but I'm also going to work with you to see what can actually be changed, see what values we have in common and how can we do things better, even if it doesn't change the entire system overnight. The good work being done protecting women from violence doesn't change the rest of the policing. The alternative prisons don't change the rest of the system, but they do demonstrate that there are other logics available. What's sustainable about all of this? Well, it's a long game. And I think anybody who's involved in kind of social activism understands that, there'll be ups and downs and peaks and troughs. And particularly at the moment, politics matters. institutions can be dismantled from within. You don't have to have a new law to destroy an institution or a new constitution. You can just dismantle it quietly by starving it of resources. And that's certainly what has happened in many places. Tackling institutional culture is a big one, how you change gender-based violence within the police. And that is very key to the United Kingdom as well. I mean, the Sarah Everard case, and I've spoken to people who've been looking into how to change policing cultures. That is a huge issue. And again, I draw inspiration from what I discovered in Brazil. And wider social attitudes. The institutions will always say, you know, we're not separate from the rest of society. We reflect society, which is largely true, but they also create their own bubbles in which certain things become more acute. So I want to end there. And what I want to say as a final comment is this: a thank you to all the human rights defenders that I have worked with. Because without them, there would be no defense of human rights. You know, the organizations that I have collaborated with, whether it's Amnesty International, the Brazilian Forum on Public Safety, or others, they're the people on the front line. They're the ones who get the death threats. They're the ones who get shot. They're the ones who really put their lives on the line. And none of this analytical work is possible unless we support those people who do that frontline work. So it has been an immense privilege for me personally to work with such incredible people in Brazil who have, as Bertolt Brecht put it, you know, you can struggle for what you believe in for a day and that's great, or you can do it for a year or several years, but for people who do it their entire lives, those are the people you really need because they're in there for the long haul. So that's what I'd like to end with, as a kind of a tribute to those people who do that work. And thank you everybody for listening to me. Thank you.